Hello, and welcome to this Seek and Prosper interview series. I'm here today with Ruth Yang. She is the Global Head of Private Market Analytics at S&P Global Ratings, and we're going to be talking about changes in fixed income markets. Ruth, welcome.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm glad to be here with you.
Ruth, we're going to travel back in time a little bit to January of 2000. A young Ruth Yang has just walked in to her job at Standard & Poor's, working in leverage commentary and debt. What was true for the job you did then that is still true for fixed income markets today?
There's a lot of differences. Technology has changed a great deal. The speed at which information travels has changed a great deal. But fundamentally, I think the common thread, which has always been true for credit, is about transparency, bringing transparency. And I think we still talk about this today. There's always a level of transparency. Back then in 2000, the broadly syndicated markets were just starting to blossom in the United States, right, in North America. They had been around for a couple of years. Prime rate funds, CLOs had all kind of been nascent in the early 1990s, mid 1990s. But what really changed as LCD was growing at that time, what was really changing was the opportunity for information services like LCD and S&P Global Ratings to bring transparency to the market. I think what's important is what we've always sought is systemic transparency and not versus situational transparency. In a private placement asset class, and BSL was blooming at that time, right? The idea was that if you were a player and you were a powerful player, you had transparency. It was situational still, even then. And our goal at LCD, and even the goal of ratings today, is to provide some level of systemic transparency so that all market participants have some view on what's going on in the market, the risk, the return, what's going on, how market dynamics are changing. But that in addition, we're able to provide insights to regulators, to, the broader markets about what's going on. But if you don't have someone stepping in and saying, okay, how do you drive this transition from situational to systemic? There's always some kind of bias in the information. And I think that's where we are today. But back then, that was kind of the goal. It was just bits and pieces coming together to provide more information to market participants.
Okay, so let's leave aside that young whippersnapper, Ruth Yang, and let's look at the last 10 years.
Yep.
Because obviously we've seen huge changes in fixed income markets over the last decade. What to you are the significant themes of those changes?
So I think the growth, obviously, of private markets has been a big part of where we've seen in the last 10 years. When we talk about this with the market, when I talk about this with the market, it really goes back to your first question, right? And it goes back before that, right? Back in the 1980s, there was the growth of the high yield bond market, the junk bond market. And then that brought corporate borrowing to a certain level. And then in the 1990s, we had the growth of broadly syndicated loans, which are banks arranging loans and then syndicating them out to institutional investors, right? Not only did BSL take market share away from bonds, we talk about that, but the truth is because BSL is a different type of credit, that it allowed the fixed income markets to diversify and take on different types of lending and fund different types of transactions. And I would argue allow corporations to grow in different ways and for the corporate world to grow in general because it had access to a more flexible, dynamic form of borrowing. Flash forward to the last 10 years, I think the rise of private markets is the same thing, right? When we look at private debt, it's a long-standing part of the credit markets. BDCs were created in 1980, so we had SME direct lending for many, many decades. What we've seen in the last 10 years is the growth of private debt, its maturation, and its scaling up. It went from funding primarily SME transactions to being able to take on multi-billion-dollar transactions and compete with the public markets to fund certain types of deals. What that leaves us with is a more dynamic and more interesting credit market. it's a very complex world. It's very complicated. The risk profiles are constantly changing. You have more leverage in certain parts of the system. You have competition on pricing and terms in other parts of the system. But I think when we look forward to the market, especially when we look at the next 5 or 10 years, where the base rate of borrowing is so much higher than it was before, right? We're looking at a high 2 or a low 3 terminal rate in the next 2 years versus 50 basis points a couple of years ago. Capital markets, the ability of borrowers to access credit markets will continue to change and evolve. We want public, private loans, bonds, and private debt to come together and be able to fund and play to their strengths for different types of borrowers and different borrower needs, and hopefully fund, kind of this rapidly evolving purpose that different companies have, right? You want to fund everything from venture capital to your very steady Eddie AAA borrower, right? You want to be able to do all of those things for healthy borrowers as well as distressed credit, but you've got to have the right types of funding there to match the risk to the return.
So we're seeing an increasingly complex market, different instruments, different borrowers. As you look forward 5 years, what kind of trends will you be looking at in terms of the evolution of fixed income markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we look ahead, and we're increasingly, hearing the same thing from other much smarter market participants than me, right? Which is this alignment between public and private, that capital raising will have 3 pieces to it: the public bond, the broadly syndicated, which is really a hybrid of public and private, right? It's a private placement transaction with a public rating because of the syndication, and then truly private debt, all being able to be available to anybody who is capital raising, right? You need to, if you're a strong BB borrower who needs to raise $5 billion, your outlook is good, you've got great financing, you've got great numbers, you're going to be able to go to bonds and loans to fund. If you are a B- negative credit, right, you're raising $5 billion, but you got some rocky waters or you're in a growth stage, maybe you go for a broadly syndicated as well as a private credit, some kind of mezzanine funding. I think that when we look ahead, there's a lot of talk about the competition between public and private. There will be competition, that's unavoidable. That's kind of part of the nature of the beast. But I think at the same time, there will be an alignment. We'll see more hybrid capital structures where borrowers are able to pick and choose and tailor their capital structure, hopefully tailor it wisely to their needs as well as their financial performance.
Well, Ruth, thank you so much for joining me for a very quick interview. I really always appreciate your time.
Thanks, Nathan. I'm always happy to be here.
And thank you all for joining us. Look forward to our other Seek and Prosper interviews coming up.